I trusted my husband with our life, our future, and our money. I believed his late nights had explanations and his excuses meant nothing. That illusion shattered the moment I uncovered the truth. My savings were gone, my account drained, and the money had been spent on things I never imagined. Luxury hotels, cash withdrawals, and purchases meant to impress prostitutes. Among the evidence were receipts for lingerie that was never meant for me. There was no screaming, no confrontation that night. Just silence, disbelief, and the slow realization that betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's hidden in bank statements and forgotten shopping bags. What he thought was his clean escape became the proof that would change everything. If this story helps you see the warning signs you've been ignoring, or gives you the courage to face a painful truth, please leave a like and subscribe. Your support helps me continue sharing these difficult but necessary stories. The moment you discover your husband has been stealing from you to pay for prostitutes is not cinematic. There's no dramatic music, no slow-motion realization, no perfectly timed confrontation. It's quiet and mundane, happening on a Tuesday afternoon while you're sorting through mail and trying to figure out why your savings account is suddenly empty. It's the sick feeling in your stomach when you see a charge for luxury lingerie you never received, followed by a hotel reservation you never made, followed by cash withdrawals that total more than your monthly salary. It's the way your hands start shaking as you scroll through bank statements. Each line item a small death. Each purchase a betrayal so profound you can't even process it at first. This is my story of how trust became my greatest vulnerability, how love made me blind, and how the evidence of my husband's double life was hidden in plain sight for years before I finally had the courage to look at it. My name is Jennifer, and I've been married to Michael for 9 years. We met when I was 26 and he was 28, both of us young professionals trying to build careers and lives in a city that felt full of possibility. I was working as a nurse at a major hospital, doing shift work that was exhausting but fulfilling, making decent money with good benefits and job security. Michael worked in corporate finance, the kind of job that came with a nice salary, expense accounts, and frequent business trips. On paper, we were the perfect match, both educated, both ambitious, both from middle-class families that had instilled strong work ethics and traditional values. Our courtship was normal, even boring in its predictability, which felt safe and comfortable after a string of dramatic relationships in my early 20s. Michael was steady, reliable, the kind of man my parents approved of immediately. He had a good job, a retirement account, plans for the future. He talked about buying a house, having children, building a life together with the same methodical approach he brought to his career. He wasn't particularly romantic or spontaneous, but I told myself that was a good thing. Those qualities meant stability, maturity, the kind of partnership that would last. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, a practical timeline that gave us time to know each other, to discuss our goals and values, to make sure we were compatible for the long term. The proposal was nice, but not extravagant. A good restaurant, a pretty ring he'd saved for, a question asked with genuine nervousness that endeared him to me. I said yes without hesitation, believing I'd found my person, my partner for life. Our wedding was modest by modern standards, about 100 guests, a nice venue, but nothing over the top, focused more on celebrating with family and friends than on creating an Instagram-worthy event. We honeymooned in Costa Rica, a trip that was beautiful and relaxing. Though even then I noticed Michael spent a lot of time on his phone, checking work emails and taking calls he said couldn't wait. I told myself this was just the reality of his demanding job, that his dedication to his career was one of the things I admired about him, that successful people made sacrifices, and I needed to be understanding. Looking back now, I see how early the pattern started, how quickly I learned to accept behavior that made me uncomfortable, how easily I rationalized things that should have raised red flags. The first few years of our marriage were what I would call comfortable. We bought a small house in a good neighborhood, furnished it piece by piece, settled into routines of work and home and occasional socializing with friends. We talked about having children, but kept postponing it. I wanted to advance in my career first, establish myself, build up some savings. Michael agreed this was sensible, though he seemed less interested in the timeline than I was, always finding reasons why "not yet" made more sense. Sex was regular, but not particularly passionate. More of a maintenance activity than an expression of deep connection. But I told myself that was normal for married couples, that the intense physical chemistry of new relationships naturally faded into something more companionable. Michael traveled frequently for work, sometimes several times a month, trips that lasted anywhere from 2 days to a week. He worked for a consulting firm that had clients all over the country, so the travel was expected, part of his job description, something I'd known about from the beginning. I didn't like being alone so often, but I understood it was necessary for his career advancement, for the income that allowed us to live comfortably, for the future we were supposedly building together. He'd call me every night when he was traveling, tell me about his day, ask about mine, maintain connection even when we were physically apart. Those calls reassured me, made me feel like despite the distance, we were still a team, still partners in this life we were creating. But there were things that didn't quite add up, small inconsistencies that I noticed but didn't know what to do with. Michael was protective of his phone in a way that seemed excessive. He kept it password protected, always face down, always within arm's reach even at home. When I'd ask to use it for something simple, like looking up a restaurant or checking the weather, he'd seem uncomfortable, would offer to look it up himself rather than handing me the device. When I mentioned this felt strange, like he was hiding something, he'd get defensive, accuse me of being paranoid or controlling, turn it around so I felt guilty for even bringing it up. I have confidential client information on there, he'd explain with exaggerated patience, as if I was being unreasonable. It's not personal, it's professional. Why don't you trust me? That question, why don't you trust me, became a weapon he used regularly, a way of making my instincts and concerns seem like character flaws on my part rather than reasonable responses to suspicious behavior. Every time I questioned something, every time my gut told me something was off, he'd respond with hurt and indignation, would make me feel like I was the problem, like my suspicions were unfair and damaging to our marriage. And because I wanted to be a good wife, because I wanted to trust my husband, because questioning him made me feel insecure and jealous, and all the things I didn't want to be, I pushed down my doubts. I apologized for being suspicious. I told myself I was overreacting. I chose to believe him over believing myself. The financial aspects of our marriage were similar. There were things that didn't make sense, but Michael always had explanations that sounded reasonable enough to accept. We kept our finances mostly separate, with a joint account for household expenses that we each contributed to monthly, but our individual accounts remained our own. This seemed practical at first. We both worked. We both contributed equally. There was no reason to completely merge our finances. But it also meant I had no visibility into what Michael was doing with his money, how much he was spending or saving, whether the financial picture he presented matched reality. Michael handled all the big-picture financial planning, our retirement accounts, investment strategies, tax preparation. He said this made sense given his background in finance, and I was happy to defer to his expertise in an area where I felt less knowledgeable. He'd show me summaries occasionally, tell me about our portfolio performance, reassure me that we were on track for our goals. I trusted him completely, never questioned the numbers he showed me, never thought to verify independently that what he was telling me was true. This trust, which I thought was a foundation of our marriage, was actually a vulnerability he was systematically exploiting. About 3 years into our marriage, I started noticing that money seemed tighter than it should be. My income was steady and good. As a nurse with several years of experience, I was making a solid middle-class salary with excellent benefits. Michael made more than me, his salary supplemented by bonuses and expense reimbursements. We should have been comfortable, building savings, maybe even starting to think about upgrading to a bigger house before having children. Instead, I found myself increasingly stressed about money, worried about unexpected expenses, unable to save as much as I wanted to. When I mentioned this to Michael, he'd blame inflation, rising costs of living, the expenses of home ownership. Everyone feels squeezed right now, he'd say dismissively. We're actually doing better than most people our age. But I wasn't so sure. I started paying more attention to our joint account, noticing that Michael's contributions seemed inconsistent, sometimes less than agreed upon, with explanations about timing of paychecks or unexpected expenses. I noticed charges on our joint credit card for things I didn't recognize. restaurants in cities where neither of us were, purchases at stores I'd never heard of, cash advances that seemed unnecessary given our salaries. Every time I asked about a charge, Michael had an answer. Client dinners he'd forgotten to expense, gifts for colleagues or family members, emergencies that required immediate cash. The answers always sounded plausible in isolation, but together they formed a pattern I didn't know how to interpret. I started feeling anxious about money in a way I never had before. I came from a working-class family that valued financial responsibility, and I'd always been good with money, budgeting carefully, saving consistently, living below my means. But now, despite having a better income than ever before, I felt financially insecure. I cut back on personal spending, stopped buying clothes or treating myself to small luxuries, put every extra dollar into savings. I took on additional shifts at the hospital when they were available, exhausting myself to earn money that somehow never seemed to translate into improved financial security. Michael praised these efforts, told me I was being smart and responsible, encouraged me to keep saving. He never suggested he should also cut back or contribute more. He never acknowledged that maybe the problem wasn't that I wasn't saving enough, but that money was disappearing somewhere it shouldn't be. Around year 5 of our marriage, I suggested we should sit down together and look at all our finances comprehensively, all accounts, all debts, all savings, create a complete picture of where we stood. Michael resisted immediately, said it wasn't necessary, that he had everything under control. When I pressed, he became irritated, accused me of not trusting him, questioned why I needed to micromanage when he was clearly handling things fine. "Do you want to take over all the financial planning?" he asked sarcastically. "Because I'm happy to hand it over if you think you can do better. But then don't complain when you realize how much work it actually is." I backed down, not wanting the conflict, not wanting to seem like I was questioning his competence. But the unease remained, growing quietly in the background like mold behind a wall. My best friend Christina was the first person to suggest explicitly that something might be wrong with my marriage. We were having lunch on one of my rare days off, and I was venting about feeling stressed about money, about Michael's frequent travel, about feeling disconnected from my husband, even when we were in the same room. Christina listened quietly, then said carefully, "Jen, I don't want to overstep, but some of what you're describing sounds concerning. The financial secrecy, the constant travel, the phone protection, those can be signs of someone hiding something significant. Have you ever looked into what Michael's actually doing when he travels? Or where your money's really going?" I felt immediately defensive, protective of my marriage and my husband. "He's not cheating, if that's what you're suggesting," I said firmly. "Michael's not like that. He's boring and predictable and works too much, but he's not sneaking around with other women." Christina held up her hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not saying he is. I'm just saying that some of the patterns you're describing, they're red flags, and you seem really stressed and unhappy. I just want to make sure you're okay, that you're not ignoring warning signs because it's easier than facing something difficult." Her words bothered me more than I wanted to admit. That night, after Michael fell asleep, I did something I'd never done before. I went through his wallet. My hands were shaking as I opened it, feeling like I was violating his privacy, betraying his trust, becoming the suspicious, paranoid wife I didn't want to be. At first, I found nothing unusual. His driver's license, credit cards, some cash, business cards from various professional contacts. Then, tucked behind his insurance card, I found a receipt from a hotel in Chicago, dated from 2 weeks earlier during one of his business trips. The charge was for 2 nights, which matched what he'd told me about the trip. But there was something else. A note scribbled on the back in handwriting that wasn't Michael's. "Had an amazing time. Can't wait to see you again. Kay." I stared at that receipt for a long time, my mind trying to make sense of it. Who was Kay? What was the amazing time they'd had? Why was this note in my husband's wallet? There could be innocent explanations. Maybe it was from a colleague, a friendly note after a successful business meeting. But the wording felt intimate, personal, romantic even. I took a photo of the receipt with my phone, then carefully put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I didn't confront Michael about it. I told myself I needed more information, more evidence, that I couldn't accuse him based on one ambiguous note. But really, I was afraid. afraid of what I might discover, afraid of what it would mean for my marriage, my future, my life that I'd worked so hard to build. Over the following weeks, I started paying closer attention, looking for things I'd previously ignored or explained away. I noticed Michael was taking more trips than necessary, sometimes to the same cities repeatedly, staying in expensive hotels when cheaper options were available. I noticed he'd shower immediately upon returning home from trips, before even greeting me properly, as if washing away evidence of something. I noticed he'd started going to the gym more frequently, had upgraded his wardrobe, was paying more attention to his appearance in ways he hadn't before. Individually, these things could be innocent, a man wanting to stay healthy and look professional. Together, they formed a picture I didn't want to see. I started checking our joint account more carefully, documenting charges that seemed questionable. There were restaurants in cities Michael traveled to, multiple charges on the same night sometimes, suggesting expensive meals with generous alcohol. There were charges at boutique shops, jewelry stores, lingerie boutiques, purchases Michael said were gifts for me or his mother or colleagues, but gifts I never saw, gifts that never materialized. There were hotel charges that were higher than seemed necessary for business travel, upgraded rooms and premium services that weren't reimbursed by his company. There were cash withdrawals, hundreds of dollars at a time, with no explanation for what the cash was used for. I created a spreadsheet, methodically documenting every questionable charge, every inconsistency, every piece of evidence that something was wrong. The process was painful, but also clarifying. Seeing it all laid out made patterns undeniable that had been easy to dismiss when they were scattered across months of statements. Over the course of 6 months, Michael had spent thousands of dollars on things I couldn't account for, money that should have been going into our joint future, but was instead disappearing into a black hole of unexplained expenses. 6 months ago, I decided I needed to know the truth, whatever it was. I couldn't keep living in this state of anxious uncertainty, couldn't keep ignoring my instincts, couldn't keep accepting explanations that didn't add up. I contacted a private investigator, something that felt dramatic and excessive, like something from a movie rather than real life. But I didn't know how else to get answers. The investigator was professional and discreet, explaining that following a spouse during business travel was relatively straightforward, that the truth usually revealed itself quickly once someone was actually paying attention. Michael had a business trip planned to Dallas, supposedly a 3-day conference followed by meetings with clients. The investigator followed him from the moment he left the airport. The report I received a week later destroyed every illusion I'd been clinging to, every hope that my suspicions were unfounded, every belief that my marriage was salvageable. Michael had gone to the conference for exactly 3 hours on the first day, making a brief appearance to justify the expense report. The rest of his time was spent with prostitutes, high-end escorts hired through agencies that catered to business travelers with money to spend and secrets to keep. The investigator's report was thorough, with photos, timeline documentation, credit card receipts. I saw pictures of Michael entering hotel rooms with women who were clearly not business colleagues. I saw receipts for charges to escort services, payments for companionship that were barely disguised as other business expenses. I saw evidence of a pattern that had been going on for years, across multiple cities, with multiple women, all funded by money that should have been building our future together. The investigator estimated, based on the evidence collected and extrapolation from past patterns, that Michael had spent somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000 on prostitutes over the course of our marriage. I couldn't breathe when I read that number, $50,000 to $70,000. Money he'd stolen from our joint account, from our shared future, from our plans to have children and buy a bigger house and retire comfortably someday. Money I'd earned through long hours of shift work, caring for sick patients, sacrificing time with family and friends to build what I thought was our shared financial security. Money that had instead been used to pay for sex with strangers, to fund a double life I'd known nothing about, to satisfy urges and desires he'd hidden from me completely. But it wasn't just the money, as devastating as that was. It was the health risk he'd exposed me to, sleeping with prostitutes and then coming home to me, putting my physical well-being at risk without my knowledge or consent. It was the lies, years of them, elaborate and consistent, told with a straight face and apparent sincerity. It was the betrayal of every promise he'd made, every vow he'd taken, every commitment that was supposed to form the foundation of our marriage. It was the realization that the man I'd married, the man I'd trusted completely, was essentially a stranger, someone capable of deception I'd never imagined possible. I sat with the investigator's report for 3 days before doing anything with it. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, made small talk with Michael, all while knowing the truth that would end our marriage. I was in shock, moving through my days in a daze, unable to fully process what I'd learned. Part of me kept thinking there must be some mistake, some explanation, some way this could be something other than what it obviously was. But the evidence was irrefutable. The photos didn't lie. The receipts were real. My husband was living a double life, and he'd been doing it for years. On the 4th day after receiving the report, I did something that would reveal even more devastating truths. I'd been avoiding looking at my personal savings account, the account I'd been contributing to religiously for years, my emergency fund that I'd built up to over $40,000 through careful saving and sacrifice. I don't know what prompted me to check it that particular morning. Maybe some instinct that I needed to know the full extent of the damage, maybe just the masochistic need to understand completely how thoroughly my life had been destroyed. I logged into my account, expecting to see my balance of approximately $42,000. Instead, I saw $237. I stared at the screen, certain there was an error, a glitch, something wrong with the website. I refreshed the page. The number didn't change. I called the bank, my voice shaking as I explained there must be some mistake, some fraudulent activity. My account should have over $40,000 in it. The customer service representative reviewed my account history and explained, in a tone that was professionally sympathetic but matter-of-fact, that there had been a series of transfers over the past 14 months, moving money out of my savings in increments of $2,000 to $3,000 at a time, all authorized through online banking with my login credentials. But I didn't make those transfers, I said, my voice rising in panic. Someone stole my login information. This is fraud. I need to report this. The representative's tone became more gentle. Ma'am, the transfers were all made to an account with your husband's name on it. Is it possible he had access to your login information and made the transfers? If so, that's not fraud in the legal sense. That's a civil matter between you and your spouse. I hung up without responding, unable to find words for what I was feeling. Michael had stolen from me. Systematically, over more than a year, he'd been draining my personal savings account, taking money I'd worked so hard to save, money that represented my security and my future. I immediately checked my other accounts, my checking account, my retirement account, even a small investment account I'd barely thought about. All of them showed similar patterns. Money transferred out, sometimes in large chunks, sometimes in smaller amounts that I might not notice missing immediately. Michael had been stealing from me for over a year, taking advantage of my trust, my long work hours that left me too tired to carefully monitor my accounts, my general belief that my husband wouldn't betray me in such a fundamental way. The total amount he'd stolen from my personal accounts was over $52,000. Combined with what he'd taken from our joint accounts and spent on prostitutes, we were talking about more than $100,000 that had disappeared into his double life. I felt physically sick, dizzy with the magnitude of the betrayal. This wasn't just infidelity, as devastating as that was on its own. This was financial abuse, theft, a systematic exploitation of my trust and my labor. Michael had stolen my money to pay for sex with other women. He'd taken the fruits of my work, the exhausting 12-hour shifts, the night shifts that destroyed my sleep schedule, the holidays spent at the hospital instead of with family, and used it to fund his secret life. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I knew I needed to act quickly to protect what little I had left. I immediately changed all my passwords, enabled two-factor authentication on every account, moved my remaining money to a new bank account Michael didn't know about. I took photos and screenshots of everything. Every bank statement showing the fraudulent transfers, every receipt from the investigator's report, every piece of evidence of Michael's theft and infidelity. I organized it all methodically, creating a digital paper trail that would be crucial for the divorce proceedings I knew were inevitable. That afternoon, I called in sick to work and went to see a divorce attorney. The lawyer listened to my story with professional sympathy, reviewed the evidence I'd brought, and was clear about what came next. I could absolutely file for divorce based on infidelity and financial abuse. The evidence of his theft from my personal accounts would be important in the asset division. The prostitution was relevant not just as grounds for divorce, but potentially as criminal activity, depending on the jurisdiction. I needed to act quickly to protect my remaining assets and my health. Getting tested for STIs immediately was crucial, given the risk Michael had exposed me to. Walking out of that attorney's office, I felt something shift inside me. The shock and devastation were still there, but underneath was something harder, stronger, anger, pure, righteous, clarifying anger at what Michael had done to me, to our marriage, to the future I'd thought we were building together. He'd stolen from me. He'd lied to me. He'd exposed me to health risks. He'd betrayed every promise and commitment our marriage was supposed to represent. And he'd done it all while coming home every night, kissing me hello, asking about my day, maintaining the facade of being a devoted husband. I made a plan for the confrontation because I knew I couldn't just leave without facing him, without telling him that I knew everything, without seeing his face when he realized his carefully constructed lies were collapsing. The attorney had advised against confronting him without someone else present, worried about potential for intimidation or violence, but I needed to do this in my own way, in my own time. I wasn't afraid of Michael physically. He'd never shown any inclination toward violence, but I was afraid of his words, his explanations, his ability to make me doubt what I knew to be true. So I needed to be prepared, armed with evidence that was irrefutable. Michael was supposed to return from a business trip, another supposedly legitimate work trip that I now knew was at least partially a cover for other activities, on a Friday evening. I took that day off work, spent it preparing, rehearsing in my mind what I would say, how I would handle his inevitable attempts to explain or justify or minimize. I had all my evidence organized, printed, and digital copies secured in multiple locations. I'd already moved my important documents and sentimental items to Christina's house for safekeeping. I'd opened a new bank account at a different bank and transferred what little money I had left into it. I was as protected as I could be given the circumstances. When Michael walked in that Friday evening, tired from his trip, he found me sitting at our dining room table with bank statements spread out in front of me, my laptop open to our account pages, the investigator's report in a folder beside me. He froze in the doorway, his expression shifting from tired greeting to confusion to something that might have been fear. "What's all this?" he asked carefully, setting down his luggage. "This," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "is evidence of everything you've been doing for years. The prostitutes, the theft from my savings account, the lies about business trips, all of it." I watched the color drain from his face, watched him calculate his next move, decide how to play this. He chose denial. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to sound confused and concerned. "What prostitutes? What theft? Jennifer, what's going on?" I felt eerily calm as I opened the investigator's report and pushed it across the table toward him. "I hired someone to follow you on your last trip to Dallas. That's photos of you entering hotel rooms with escorts you hired. That's receipts for charges to escort services. That's a timeline of your activities, which included maybe 3 hours of actual work and 2.5 days of paying for sex." He stared at the report, not touching it, as if refusing to engage with it would make it not real. "You hired a private investigator? You had someone following me?" His tone was indignant, as if I was the one who'd done something wrong. "Yes," I said simply, "because you've been lying to me for years and I needed to know the truth. And now I do." I pulled up my bank statements on my laptop, turned it so he could see. "This is my savings account. The one that had over $40,000 in it that I'd saved over the course of our marriage. It now has $237 in it. Because you stole from me. You transferred money out of my personal account without my knowledge or permission and used it to pay for prostitutes." Michael sat down heavily in a chair, his face ashen. For a long moment, he said nothing, and I watched him trying to formulate some response, some explanation that would make this okay. Finally, he said, "I can explain. It's not what you think." I laughed, a bitter sound that surprised both of us. "It's not what I think? Michael, I have photo evidence of you with prostitutes. I have bank statements showing you stole over $50,000 from my personal accounts. I have receipts showing you've spent tens of thousands more from our joint accounts on your secret life. What exactly is it not? He tried several approaches over the next hour. First, he minimized. It wasn't that much money, I was overreacting. Lots of people did worse things. When that didn't work, he blamed. He was stressed from work. I wasn't meeting his needs. Our sex life had gotten boring. Then he explained he had a problem, a sex addiction maybe, something he needed help with but couldn't control. Then he bargained. He'd go to therapy. He'd pay me back. He'd never do it again. Couldn't I give him another chance? Finally, when nothing else worked, he got angry. I'd violated his privacy by hiring an investigator. I was destroying our marriage over a mistake. I was being vindictive and unforgiving. Through all of it, I sat quietly, letting him exhaust his repertoire of manipulation tactics, feeling nothing but a cold, clear certainty about what needed to happen next. When he finally ran out of words, I said simply, "I've already filed for divorce. The papers will be served to you next week. I want you out of this house tonight. You can stay in a hotel. You're clearly familiar with them. My attorney will be in contact about asset division and the restitution you owe me for the theft from my personal accounts." "You're really doing this?" he asked, and he seemed genuinely surprised, as if he'd believed that even now, even with all the evidence laid out, he could talk his way out of consequences. "Over a few mistakes? We've been married for 9 years, Jennifer. You're just going to throw that all away?" I stood up, gathering my papers. "You threw it away," I said. "You threw it away every time you hired a prostitute instead of coming home to your wife. You threw it away every time you stole from my savings account to fund your secret life. You threw it away with years of lies and betrayals. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm just finally accepting what you destroyed a long time ago." Michael left that night, and I changed the locks immediately after he was gone, as my attorney had advised. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, financial investigations, and emotional devastation. I got tested for every STI I could think of, terrified of what I might find, grateful beyond measure when everything came back negative. I worked with my attorney to trace all the fraudulent transfers and build a case for restitution. I worked with my bank to file fraud claims on the transfers from my accounts, though with limited success since the bank's position was that this was a civil matter between spouses rather than criminal fraud. The divorce itself was ugly. Michael fought me on everything: the asset division, the restitution for his theft, even basic facts about what had happened. He hired a lawyer who tried to paint me as vindictive and greedy, who argued that money in a marriage belongs to both spouses regardless of whose account it's in, who suggested that my hiring of an investigator showed I was the untrustworthy one. But my evidence was too strong, too thoroughly documented, too clearly showing a pattern of deliberate deception and theft. The judge was not sympathetic to Michael's arguments. Through the investigation process, I learned even more disturbing details. Michael had been soliciting prostitutes almost from the beginning of our marriage, though the frequency and expense had increased over the years. He'd been active on various online forums where men shared information about escorts and services, where he'd posted reviews and recommendations under an anonymous username. He'd taken business trips that weren't actually business trips at all, entire vacations to other cities funded by our joint money, and spent entirely with prostitutes. He'd bought gifts for these women: jewelry, lingerie, flowers, while telling me we needed to be careful with money, that we couldn't afford the things I wanted for our future. The lingerie was perhaps the most painful discovery among all the evidence. Sorting through the documentation of Michael's purchases, I found receipts from high-end boutiques for expensive lingerie, multiple purchases over the years, all made during his business trips, or sometimes even locally when he was supposedly running errands. These weren't gifts for me. I'd never received any of them, would have remembered such extravagant presents. They were gifts for the prostitutes he was seeing, purchased with our money, probably worn once and then discarded, meaningless tokens in transactions that had cost me everything. I found one of these receipts in Michael's study after he'd moved out, while I was packing up his remaining belongings. It was from a luxury lingerie boutique in Atlanta, during a trip I remembered clearly because Michael had called me that night and told me how much he missed me, how he couldn't wait to be home. The receipt showed a purchase of over $300 for a silk bra and panty set, matching robe, and something described as a delicate harness. I held that receipt in my shaking hands and felt the full weight of his betrayal crash over me again. While he was on the phone telling me he missed me, he'd been shopping for expensive lingerie to give to a prostitute he'd be seeing that night. The hypocrisy, the cruelty, the absolute disregard for me and our marriage. It was overwhelming. I became somewhat obsessed with the evidence after that, going through every receipt, every bank statement, every credit card charge, trying to piece together the full picture of Michael's double life. It was painful but also necessary, a way of making real what had happened, of preventing myself from minimizing or forgetting the extent of his betrayal. I created a timeline that spanned our entire marriage, marking every trip, every suspicious charge, every lie I could identify in retrospect. The patterns were clear and consistent. Michael had been living a secret life for essentially our entire marriage, funding it with my money and our shared resources, all while maintaining the facade of being a loving, faithful husband. The financial damage was catastrophic. Beyond the money Michael had directly stolen or spent, there was the cost of the divorce itself, attorney fees, court costs, investigator fees, all the expenses of unraveling a life we'd built together. There was the loss of our shared assets, the house we'd have to sell at a loss in a difficult market, the retirement accounts that had to be divided when neither of us had nearly enough saved yet. There was my destroyed credit score, damaged by joint accounts Michael had maxed out and joint debts he refused to pay his share of. There was the reality that at 35, I was starting over financially, with less than nothing, in debt and devastated and alone. But the emotional damage was worse than the financial. My ability to trust had been destroyed. My judgment of people and situations felt completely unreliable. If I'd been so wrong about Michael, how could I trust my assessment of anyone else? My sense of self-worth had been decimated by the realization that while I'd been sacrificing and saving and planning for our future, he'd been spending that future on strangers. That my contributions to our marriage had meant so little to him that he'd stolen from me without apparent guilt or hesitation. The shame was crushing. Even though rationally I knew I wasn't responsible for his choices, I felt stupid for not seeing the signs sooner, humiliated by how thoroughly I'd been deceived. I started therapy, both to process the trauma of what had happened and to try to understand how I'd missed the warning signs for so long. My therapist helped me see that I'd been the victim of financial abuse, a form of domestic violence that's often invisible and rarely recognized. She helped me understand that Michael's behavior fit classic patterns of abusers: the isolation, the gaslighting, the systematic stealing of resources, the double life maintained through elaborate lies. She helped me recognize that my trust wasn't a weakness that had been exploited, but a normal part of a committed relationship that Michael had betrayed. She helped me start the long process of rebuilding my sense of self, my confidence, my ability to trust my own judgment. The divorce was finalized 8 months after I'd confronted Michael with the evidence of his betrayal. The settlement included restitution for the money he'd stolen from my personal accounts. Though I knew actually collecting it would be difficult if not impossible, Michael had already started hiding assets, claiming poverty, setting up barriers to prevent me from recovering what he owed. But I had the judgment, the legal recognition that what he'd done was theft, that I'd been wronged, that I was owed compensation. That mattered, even if the actual money never materialized. I sold our house, taking a significant loss but needing to sever that final connection to Michael and the life we'd shared. I moved into a small apartment, started rebuilding my savings from zero, worked extra shifts to try to recover financially from the devastation Michael had caused. I cut off all contact with him except through our attorneys, blocked his number and social media, refused to engage with any of his attempts to reach out. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to another city, started over somewhere new, was probably already deceiving someone else. The thought made me sick, but there was nothing I could do to warn his new victim except hope that she'd be smarter than I was, more observant of the warning signs, less willing to accept explanations that didn't quite add up. 1 year after discovering the truth about Michael's double life, I'm still rebuilding. My savings account has a few $1,000s in it again. Not much, but it's mine, earned through my own labor, safe from anyone who might steal it. My credit is slowly improving as I pay down the debt and the negative marks age off my report. My apartment is small, but it's peaceful, free from the anxiety and uncertainty that had become constant during my marriage. I'm in therapy regularly, working through the trauma, learning to trust my instincts again, slowly opening myself to the possibility that someday I might be ready for a relationship again, though that day still feels very far away. I've started speaking out about financial abuse, sharing my story with domestic violence organizations, trying to raise awareness about this hidden form of abuse that so many people experience but don't recognize. I want other women to know that if their partner is secretive about money, if accounts don't add up, if they feel constantly anxious about finances without understanding why, if their partner is stealing or hiding or lying, those are serious red flags that need to be addressed immediately. I want them to know that financial abuse often accompanies other forms of abuse, that someone who will steal from you financially likely has few qualms about betraying you in other ways. I want them to know that trust is important in a relationship, but so is verification, that maintaining some financial independence and awareness isn't a sign of distrust, but a basic protection of your future. The lingerie receipts still haunt me sometimes. There's something so deliberately cruel about Michael spending hundreds of dollars on expensive, intimate gifts for prostitutes while telling me we couldn't afford the things I wanted, while asking me to cut back on spending, while stealing from my savings account. It wasn't just about sex. He could have hired prostitutes without the expensive gifts, without the elaborate courting. The gifts were about something else. Some need to pretend these transactions were relationships, to create the illusion of romance with women he was paying to pretend to want him. And he funded that illusion with my money, my labor, my future. I think about the me who existed before I discovered the truth, the woman who trusted her husband completely, who believed in the marriage they were building, who sacrificed and saved for a future that was never going to materialize the way she imagined. I mourn for her innocence and trust, for the life she thought she was living. But I'm also grateful to be on this side of the truth, however painful. Living in ignorance while being systematically betrayed and stolen from isn't actually better than knowing, even though the knowing is devastating. The truth, however terrible, is always better than the lie. If you're reading this and recognizing patterns in your own relationship, please listen to that recognition. Please check your bank accounts, monitor your credit report, maintain some financial independence and awareness. Please trust your instincts when something feels off, even if you can't articulate exactly what's wrong. Please know that secretiveness about money is a red flag, that financial abuse is real abuse, that you deserve financial security and honesty from your partner. And please know that discovering your partner has been stealing from you to fund a secret life doesn't mean you were stupid or blind. It means you trusted someone who didn't deserve that trust, which is their failing, not yours. Michael thought I'd stay silent. He thought I'd be too ashamed to tell anyone what he'd done, too embarrassed by my own gullibility to seek help, too invested in the illusion of our marriage to destroy it by exposing the truth. He was wrong. I'm not silent. I'm telling my story, loud and clear, to anyone who will listen, because silence protects abusers and leaves victims isolated and ashamed. And I refuse to be silent about what was done to me, refuse to protect Michael's reputation at the expense of my own healing, refuse to let shame keep me from warning others about the patterns and red flags I missed. My name is Jennifer. I'm 35 years old. I'm a nurse who was financially abused and systematically deceived by my husband of 9 years. He stole over $50,000 from my personal savings accounts and spent tens of thousands more of our shared money to pay for prostitutes, buying them expensive gifts, including lingerie with money that should have been building our future together. And I survived it. I'm rebuilding my life, stronger and wiser for what I've been through, determined that no one else will benefit from my silence about what happened. Thank you for reading my story. If this resonated with you, helped you recognize red flags in your own relationship, or gave you courage to face a difficult truth, please like, subscribe, and share. Together, we can break the silence around financial abuse and support survivors in their journey to recovery.